Hello, everybody. Either I say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Patrick M. Hayes. And Patrick is an enterprise security strategist and the author of Integrated Assurance Unified Risk Strategy. And I'm sure it's a long time showing us 3 decades of experience at the intersection of cybersecurity, risk, governance, and IT operations. He has worked with Fortune 500 companies, public sector agencies, and high growth technology firms, helping them build resilience through strategic alignment. And he is also the creator of the Integrated Assurance Maturity Model, a groundbreaking framework designed to unify cybersecurity, IT, and business performance. And Patrick is widely recognized as a thought leader in cyber risk, enterprise security architecture, and digital transformations, which is quite popular nowadays. And he is a highly after speaker on how organizations can break down silos and embedded assurance across the enterprise. And today, you are all coming from different countries and regions, and we are very fortunate to have him with us today to share his insights on integrated assurance and the next evolution in enterprise security. Here, let me check how many are there and telling us where they are from joining us. And I can see Malaysia, Namibia, and Cape Town, everybody from Athens, Greece, greetings from Germany, South Africa. Everybody is joining us, and still we are welcoming new colleagues and any others. Johannesburg, Loseto, please join us and tell where you are currently. For instance, I'm in Ankara, the capital city of Ankara, and Patrick is joining us from Michigan. And GGA is, originally located in South Africa. Imagine such a global, audience, and we are proud of our esteemed guest speaker. And Hong Kong, another Malaysia, Brazil, Dubai, Cape Town, UK. Thank you very much for joining us. So, Pakistan, Albania, very good. Thank you very much, dear old Spain. And Dr. Reiner is also joining us. Thank you very much, Reiner. And South Africa, greetings to everybody. And I think please join me in giving a warm welcome to Patrick Hayes for starting the conversation. And I would like to ask the very first and the difficult question to start our session. Are you ready, Patrick?
Yes, please
Welcome.
go ahead. Thank you.
So here, the topic is the integrated assurance and the next evolution in enterprise security. What inspired you to develop the concept of this integrated assurance? The very first question, please. Thank you.
Yeah, and a good question. I've spent upwards of 25 years in security, risk, governance, risk and compliance. And the one thing that I've seen consistently in small, medium, large organizations is silos. Different teams tackling risk and security and operations from different aspects, having different metrics, having chasing after different outcomes. And when you look into each one of these silos, there's no shortage of frameworks or standards or guidelines. The real challenge is that they don't tend to work really well together. When you think about the whole world of GRC or security, you have people, process, and technology, and these things should be working in harmony. And unfortunately, when you have, fairly siloed environments, they work in harmony in their silos, but they don't work in harmony together. And so, I've discovered that there's a lot of really great frameworks. There's a lot of good guidelines and standards, and folks are all trying to meet the performance objectives that they have for the business, but the business lacks the fabric amongst those different silos to bring them together, to really focus on bringing that resilience across all of these lines of business, to then truly adopt an integrated approach to assurance. So we have these siloed pockets of security, these siloed pockets of operational excellence, these siloed pockets of audit, but they don't really work together really well. And the larger the organization, the more vast the silos, the deeper the silos run, and the more challenging it is to stay ahead of today's current threat landscape.
So here I can ask that how would you explain integrated assurance to a business executive who doesn't live in the weeds of cybersecurity or even risk management? What could you say about this?
Well, one of the really clear objectives that I set out for was to create a culture around assurance, not just security, not just operational excellence, not just meeting compliance and regulatory standards, but really a culture around what is assurance to an organization. And well, that starts with business and business strategy. Most business leaders and executives are disconnected from the lower level or in the weeds of what security really means to an organization. Oftentimes they'll think it's meeting regulatory compliance, or they'll think it's, how did we do in our last audit, or can we be attacked with ransomware, or multiple things like that. The reality is that assurance spans across all facets of the business, and it's meant to support the strategy of the business. So when you think about IT operations maintaining uptime and maintaining accessibility to your e-commerce systems or to your employees' applications and systems, and doing that securely and doing that within regulation and within the laws and the boundaries of the laws, it still needs to speak to the strategy of the company, the reason why the company is in business in the first place. And I think a lot of leaders miss the connection between what IT, security, and audit and risk are trying to do for the business in supporting that strategy. So I think there's a common language that needs to be adopted across all these silos and these pillars within organizations, so that they understand, here's how I contribute to the strategy of the business. Here's how the business sees, what I'm contributing to support that strategy.
So here you mentioned about the culture and establishing a kind of system. This means you are critical of traditional assurance model and what's broken about them.
Well, I wouldn't say I'm terribly so critical, yes. The criticality of it is that they're fragmented. Most models are backwards looking, and they're slow. When you think about doing a security assessment, or you think about your last audit, it's a point in time picture of what you did to get there. And it's really only as good as the paper it was written on the day it was produced. I was a PCI QSA for a long period of time. And every time that I handed over a report to a customer, I let them know this report is expiring the moment I hand it to you. because the very minute you do something different after this report has been given to you, you've already changed your environment. The report is already stagnant. It's already old. It's not necessarily applicable anymore. And the reality is that we have that fragmented across all facets of the organization, right? So, IT operations, they adopt ITIL or COVID or some other standard, and how regularly do they stay on top of network and application drift? How do they maintain the standards that folks need to implement systems and maintain systems, and patching and versioning and all of that? So I find it to be very fragmented. I feel like we get a report, it creates a level of comfort, and we feel like we're secure, or we feel like we've created controls that, unfortunately, when tested in real life, well, that's when the controls seem to break, because culturally we haven't tested those controls together. Yeah, sure, we can do some tabletops, and we can orchestrate a security event, but the reality is that you learn what your peers are like in the midst of a true event, right? In a true ransomware event, or a true malware attack, or a true DDoS attack, or a true enterprise shutdown. And um, when you haven't tested that culturally, not just based on your controls, but when you haven't tested that, when you haven't worked culturally as a team to resolve those issues, that's when you really start to see the fragments across those silos. You're dealing from, IT ops has different information than security has. Risk and audit is operating on controls that they believed were in place based on policies, but the control objectives may only be partially enforced. And there may have not been any recent testing to ensure that those controls are in fact enforced. And so I just think that traditional assurance models, they leave a lot of gaps. They're fragmented, and they're typically pretty backwards looking as opposed to forward thinking.
So here you talk about the enterprise risk gap. Uh, then I need to ask, what is that and why does it matter for the organizations?
Well, so the enterprise risk gap often is the result of doing an assessment, going through an audit, submitting your compliance paperwork, and believing that those controls that you've just audited are in fact in place and doing the things that you need to have them done. I worked with one large enterprise that, they believe that, yes, we actually have these controls in place. They meet our policies. And look, we have the technology deployed in order to enforce those controls. But then when you look deeper, the technology was only deployed across 40% of their staff. And when we actually tested the controls on the 40% of the staff that had the controls in place, or the technology in place, it was only effective 20% of the time, because some had it turned off, and some policies weren't actually configured properly. So the gap exists between what we believe is the control, what we write down on our compliance paperwork, and the actual use of that control. And then it goes a step further, that these gaps they're typically what attackers will exploit, right? So if you have a control that states that you need to maintain, current operating systems on all of your critical systems, but your patching window is 8 weeks, and you can only patch during certain periods of time during business operations, well, that creates a gap in your controls. And an attacker, over the course of time, and especially using things like agentic AI, they can learn these things from you over time, and they can see these gaps in your controls, and it doesn't manifest in your policies. It manifests in the dwell time between you actually doing something about the control, enforcing the control, and maintaining your standards. And cybersecurity, your cybersecurity team may not have any idea that you have these gaps in your operational controls that create these exploitation windows. And that's really where I think having this lack of commonality and having these silos really creates the opportunity for attackers to exploit the gaps between our controls and the gaps between our teams, and this misunderstanding that we actually have great security policies in place or great security activity in place.
Yeah. So here you mostly mention about the attackers and
Mm.
our, operational controls and everything. So this means there is a missing part which you, mention in your book, the integrated assurance. Is integrated assurance a framework or something else entirely? What can you say about this?
So I wouldn't call it a framework as much as a blueprint. Um, Integrated assurance is a model. It's like a way of operating and um, and an ability to create a maturity a path across multiple domains in your environment that brings existing frameworks together, right? So whether you're using ISO or whether you're following NIST or whether you're, you know, whether your architecture practices follows the Sherwood Applied Business Security architecture practices, or whether you follow TOGAF, or whether you're using ITIL or COBIT or COSO for ESRM. Um, Ideally, integrated assurance is meant to use the best components of the frameworks you're already using today to create a common language and culture across the silos within your organization. So I had a friend reach out to me just a short period of time ago, and he asked me, he goes, I just took an organization through a security maturity assessment, and we discovered that they're lacking some controls in their IT operations that's creating security gaps. So what do you recommend? Should I, what controls could I put in, give them recommendations about so that we can address these gaps? And I said, well, they're a fairly large organization that you're working with. What are the standards that their IT organization use today? And he said, well, they've adopted ITIL. And I said, well, ITIL does already have those standards in place. All you need to do is identify and address those standards and then map them to the security gaps that you've discovered as a part of your assessment. And now you've got a common language between your IT operations team and your security team with standards that they currently use today. So integrated assurance is it's not another framework. It really is a model. It's a blueprint, and it creates a level of maturity to address these things across different silos within your organization.
Yeah, here, how does integrated assurance help with emerging threats? We are all talking about AI-driven attacks. How do you evaluate this?
So that's really an interesting question, and it's a lot of work that I've been doing in the very recent past, and I've actually recently wrote a research paper on this that I'll share with you. Um, so AI is a brand new attack surface, and I think a lot of organizations misunderstand the fact that AI creates an entirely new attack surface within their environments. As our businesses rapidly adopt this largely ungoverned, um, beyond technology solution, there's so many components and facets of AI that bleed into most organizations today. It's ungoverned for the most part, and engineering and architecture have very little oversight into the adoption and deployment of AI. Shadow AI is proliferant, right? So if organizations aren't adopting AI, employees are adopting AI outside of the organization and bringing organizational information into it. And so I think there's been some government regulation, government work around, introducing AI legislation, AI adoption, governance, right? The EU is ahead of that. The US government has introduced some. I think that NIST has introduced some guidance, ISO has introduced some guidance. The reality, though, is organizations are slow to adopt guidance. I think that they're quick to adopt anything that will improve performance, anything that has the ability to reduce cost or increase profits. The reality is that AI is a new threat vector. AI is a new attack surface. And you have these organizations that are implementing like MCP, it's an entirely new attack plane, and it's largely ungoverned. Yes, there's guidelines and there's guardrails, but those guardrails stop at actual governance and actual policy, and they stop at the actual ability to monitor drift or monitor hallucinations of AI or to monitor improper use or biases. And I think, we've largely adopted AI far quicker than our ability to secure AI and to provide assurance around that model. I've recently actually done a talk on agentic AI and the MITRE ATT&CK kill chain. And we're literally 24 months away or sooner from agentic AI being able to execute attacks without human intervention, without human guidance. And that's scary. I mean, yes, we need to shape it. Humans need to be involved. But just imagine you no longer need human intervention for reconnaissance. You no longer need human intervention for persistence. You no longer need it for lateral movement. These agents are developing and moving and learning on their own, unlike a typical attacker who will pause and think and pause and think and in between attacks. Agentic AI doesn't do that. It can move and it can adapt and it can learn from you real time. And I think a lot of organizations should really take a hard look at how they're adopting AI from an architecture and governance perspective.
When you say these things, moving, adapting, and making it real time, then we should really focus on integrated assurance model. And in that respect, what are the key components or let's say domains that make up the integrated assurance model?
So there are 6 domains that I've identified as part of integrated assurance, and they really focus on the key components of what we're operating in right now. So governance, architecture, IT operations, risk compliance and audit, metrics, and importantly, culture. And I think, we can integrate across each of these silos, but we also need to build a culture around assurance, around resilience. Folks don't, we can't stop at security awareness training and believe that we're in a position that our folks understand what we need to do from a security standpoint. Culture means that it's welcome to bring assurance gaps forward. They see executive management, they see their leaders actually talking from an insurance mindset or assurance perspective. And then there's a number of levels of maturity across that. So you have from fragmented, which is where I would say 70+% of organizations sit today in their fragmented silos, where each domain has some level of assurance or quality control or operational control or policies, all the way through defined, aligned, and then to embedded and institutionalized. Now, the other thing about this maturity model, unlike, say, other models like NIST tiers or CMMI, it's okay to not be mature at the top level in each one of them. This is really defined by the inherent risk of your organization and just how much risk you're willing to accept as part of your residual risk, right? So, your inherent risk is essentially what you start out with. I'm a bank and I have the inherent risk of a bank, right? But I might be a bank that wants to aggressively expand by acquiring other banks to get more customers and expand into new markets. Well, you've now changed your risk profile outside of the basic inherent risk of being a bank. Now you're a bank that wants to aggressively grow through strategic acquisition and expansion. Well, your program needs to support that. All of the facets of your business need to support your strategy, as opposed to, yes, we need to keep our systems online and security needs to be able to detect, respond, and keep us safe from threat. Well, in fact, you might have a different risk profile, which means that your maturity might look different than somebody else in your industry, and maybe you need to have different protections around fraud, or maybe you need to have different protections around API integrations because now you're acquiring these banks, and rather than replacing their systems, you need to integrate to their systems. So risk profile is a very it's based on the inherent risk, but it's very unique to the strategy of an organization. And I think a lot of people overlook that, especially security practitioners, as they get into, helping organizations address their, their risk needs and their assurance needs. There really is strategy influence over what the risk profile is.
Yeah, thank you. Especially inherent risk and the risk profile, these are really connected and boardroom decisions. And in that
Yes.
respect, how does integrated assurance help bridge the gap between the boardroom and let's say system and organizations control, the SOC? What can you say about this?
So the one commonality that I often see is the folks in security operations, or from an operational perspective, or in cybersecurity, they're often disconnected business strategy, and the leaders are actually often disconnected from what really happens in a SOC, or what happens in operational security, or what happens when the rubber hits the road, so to speak. Right? Aren't you protecting us from ransomware? Aren't we good defending ourselves against attackers? And why does policy need to tie to these things? And I think what ends up happening is you have these cybersecurity leaders that look at budgeting and say we need more tools, and we need to be able to improve our stance against attackers and whatnot. And you have business executives and finance people saying, what does that mean from an investment perspective, and how does that help me avoid risk, and how is this different than insurance, right? And what's missing is really a common language to say, here's the risk that we have left over, right? So we've looked at the overall risk of the organization. We see what that risk brings to us, and here's what we're doing about it today. Now, here are the things we're not doing anything about, and here's why it's important that we invest in reducing this risk. But the challenge is, it's not a tools conversation. It's not a technology conversation. And cybersecurity people like to, and not all of them, but they tend to like to have tools conversations, and executives don't understand tools conversations. They understand investment. So if I have 6 things on my risk register that came out of an assessment, or came out of identifying gaps, well, what does that mean from an investment perspective? Not all of them are the same, right? So are there some that I can accept? Are there some that I just can't accept and I have to do something about it? And so what is the impact of that? So if I have, if I have to segregate my network environment in order to provide better protections for critical systems, well, I can understand the cost because you're telling it's going to, well, that's about a $3 million project. But really, what does that investment get me in terms of return on risk and return on investment and return on value? Does segregating our environment and spending $3 million on this project, does that reduce our risk and our attack surface by 10 to $1 billion in potential attacks, or does it protect our systems? And I think we're not really having investment conversations. We're having technology conversations, or we're having policy conversations. And we really need to leverage the language of executives and the language of business to understand what are we really bringing to the business. Security and assurance is not a cost of doing business. It is a strategic enabler that either needs to be in place because it's regulated, or it supports the strategy of the company and their growth objectives, or their or the company's objectives.
Thank you. I mean, when you say strategic enabler, it's really important to create awareness. If they want to reduce their risk, yes, they need to get ready. So here, for organizations starting from the scratch, what is the first step toward adopting integrated assurance?
Well, oftentimes what I would do is um, I would I would map as existing controls against business priorities, right? So we have policies, we have controls, and how do these actually align with the priorities of the business? Yep, we all spend money on protecting our perimeter. We all spend money on detecting things that are coming into our environment. But once they're in our environment, do we have those controls mapped? Do we even understand that insider threat and humans still present a very large attack vector or attack surface? AI has presented itself as a completely new attack vector to us. How do we map the importance of those controls to the priorities of the business? And so what gaps are left over, right? What's left over when we're thinking about how are we supporting the priorities of the business? And what are things that are, what are things that are missing, or where are the gaps within that? And what are we going to do about those things, right? And I think that's probably where I would start if I was starting from scratch.
What is the biggest misconception people have when they first hear about integrated assurance? What do you think about this?
Um, so I've been talking about integrated assurance for probably 15 years now. And this is really the first time I've put it in book format. And oftentimes what I hear is, well, it's just another framework. Oh, it's just another maturity model. And in fact, I've not created a competing model to ISO. I've not created a competing model to ESRM or ERM or SABSA. I have great respect for all those standards and all of those frameworks. What I have created is I have created a fabric that weaves them together. Oftentimes, when I was doing security architecture training with large organizations, they would say, well, what is the right answer? And I said, the right answer is the one that works for your organization, right? I'm not telling you to throw away TOGAF in light of a different framework. You have it. Why don't we use it appropriately? And why don't we map it to other frameworks, right? I'm not telling you to change regulatory compliance frameworks to map with ISO versus NIST. These things should harmonize across each of these compliance frameworks and work with a security guideline or a security framework. Integrated assurance isn't a new framework. Integrated assurance isn't a way to replace other frameworks. It's actually the way to get the best out of all frameworks working together. And the larger the organization, the more valuable it becomes, because framework adoption seems to have happened in silos. And it shouldn't be the case, because these things are meant to work together. Even though they weren't authored to work together in many cases, they really are meant to support each other. And there is really a way to map this from a common language, from a common culture perspective. And really, that's the barrier. The barrier is is a concerted effort and support around having a culture of assurance. Assurance isn't really meant to slow down the business. It's really meant to be there to help enable decisions faster, because you're not wondering what framework IT operations is working from, or in most cases, you don't care what framework they're working from. You have your cybersecurity framework and you need to address it from that standpoint. But the reality is, if you have shared understanding, if you have shared telemetry, if you have shared guidance, it's a lot easier to respond to risk faster, or plan around risk, or develop capabilities for the business around that risk, as opposed to trying to understand how each group is operating and what metrics they're operating under. So yeah, it's not a new framework. It's a blueprint. It's a way of weaving those things together.
After that, I can ask, how does integrated assurance, you mentioned about, common culture, common language, and finding the right answers for, company needs and their strategy. How does integrated assurance support transformation efforts like cloud, artificial intelligence, or digital modernization? What can you say about this?
So like my statement around AI,
Mhm.
we try and bake it in from the start, right? I spent a lot of time in the world of application security, and oftentimes what would happen is product teams would set out their requirements and their features and write their stories, and engineering would build, and then security would come along and test it. You have SAST and DAST testing, or you have your SEA testing on, your code repositories and the rest. But what about the actual requirements in the first place? Is the code being developed securely? Have we taken security threat modeling into a consideration as we actually introduce new features or introduce new capabilities? And that's what I mean by integrated assurance having a different impact. If we're going to migrate workloads from traditional IT infrastructure to the cloud, well, what security considerations should we take into consideration? What regulatory considerations, what legal and country guidelines should we take into consideration as we actually do this migration into these new environments? Security and assurance shouldn't really slow it down. What it should do is prevent all the rework that happens after the fact, right? I mean, as a fellow that spent a lot of time in application development and application security, oftentimes the best time to find security flaws in your development lifecycle is at the start, and to identify that through your threat modeling. You know, testing white box, black box, and whatnot, it identifies vulnerabilities, but does it identify misuse or user workarounds? Because if you introduce something, users will find a way, and if users can find a way, attackers definitely will find a way.
Very true. And here you mention about the trust velocity and also recovery, return on investments. These are new assurance metrics. What those mean in practice? What do you think about this? And how can you connect this to the practice? Thank you.
Yeah, so trust velocities, it's not a novel concept. Ideally, when you think about trust, right, you build trust across your organization, you'll build trust across domains, you build trust with your suppliers and your partners, and ideally, trust velocity builds a lot slower than it's lost, right? After a breach, after an incident, after a supplier introduces an attacker into your environment, well, we suddenly lack trust, or it takes a while for that trust to rebuild. And integrated assurance is really a trust model that allows for, or supports a trust model that allows for quickly reestablishing trust after confidence has been lost. And by introducing steps in assurance that identify these areas where, yes, we do need to have some trust modeling, but that trust modeling needs to extend into suppliers' AI environments, or it needs to extend beyond the checklists that are provided to us by CMMC if you're a federal contractor. We really do need to understand, if we're operating in a world of trust, how quickly can it be built? How quickly can it be destroyed? And how quickly can we rebuild it after the fact? And recovery ROI is, how really do you, it's not necessarily how fast you recover, how fast you get your systems back online, but how quickly you do that and learn from it. What did you learn from the last outage? What did you learn from your last attack? Is there, a no fault lessons learned session where we actually understand well, how could this have come to be? And what things can we do to prevent this in the future? And how do we identify these things quicker? And how do we do that without folks feeling like they're being punished or they're being singled out? Things happen, right? I mean, this is the one common thing that I've said throughout my entire career. Security and assurance exists because IT is hard, business is hard, and it's hard to keep up and maintain business operations and still do all the right things in IT, right? Systems drift, OS changes, um, things happen between, you get broken APIs, and things in the IT world move much faster than traditional business operations did 50 to 100 years ago. And so security is there not as a safety net, but a partner to help identify areas where we can shore up these things that are happening in our IT environments. I mean, a good example is, what if we've identified multiple vulnerabilities across our environment? Well, IT doesn't have the manpower necessarily to patch all of those systems so quickly that they might be able to avoid the exploitation windows. Well, if assurance is in play and you have a good security partner within your organization, um, then they would change their monitoring, or maybe they change their temporary guidance around those systems that have vulnerabilities. Maybe it's not the classification of the systems themselves, but maybe the treatment of those systems gets escalated while we go through a patching cycle to repair them or to bring those systems up to standard. And that would be a good partnership between IT and security operations, as opposed to security walking in the room saying, we had these vulnerabilities last week, we have them again this week, you haven't done anything about it, and now we're going to be attacked, right? That's a terrible relationship.
So you mentioned about the importance of security and assurance, and where do most organizations struggle when trying to operationalize this integrated assurance?
Well, the first is moving away from static reports. We all
Mhm.
have great reports on uptime and turnaround and user use and all these things. And even in security, number of events and number of, mean time to detect and mean time to respond and all these things. But ideally, these are isolated reports in single functions of the organization, right? Um, the other is translating this into kind of daily practice, right? We still have our silos, and we still operate as a security team and as an IT operations team and as an architecture team and as a governance team, right? And business leaders, oh no, I have to talk to the security team. And like, the reality is that once we break these silos that measure performance and measure objectives separately, we start seeing improvements. We start seeing shared dashboards. We start seeing shared language and shared telemetry that allows us all to do our jobs better.
So, I mean, here you have a great experience, more than 3 decades, and it's really a valuable thing to share with all the colleagues listening and watching us. And in that sense, if you had just 60 seconds to pitch a CEO on why they need integrated assurance, what would you say? It's a difficult question, but
Yeah. Putting this into a 60-second, what is it, an elevator ride or whatever
yeah,
folks say, right? Is
true.
um, think of integrated assurance as something that helps protect the growth of your business without slowing it down. It unifies security and operations to build trust across across your silos and make them actionable. Instead of relying on kind of these lagging reports, you actually have forward thinking and real time evidence to how your strategy is being executed across all the areas of assurance that counts.
So thank you very much. And
Sure.
have a look for the questions also coming and some comments. Thank you very much for your valuable contributions. The first question is coming from Zudwa Bill. Are there standards and codes specific to integrated assurance to enhance organization assurance culture? This is the first question.
Yes, I actually have an entire chapter on cultural alignment and cultural adoption of assurance practices. Um, I speak a lot about trust. I speak a lot about the non-punitive actions of bringing security issues forward. I have actually been in organizations where people are kind of fearful to bring issues forward, right? Oh, I found this security flaw in our software, and um, nobody wants to hear about it. Well, you have to have a culture of bringing these things forward. So, yeah, I think it starts with our leadership, but ideally we need to develop a culture of that. And like I said, there's an entire chapter on cultural adoption of assurance.
Thank you. So the
Sure.
second question coming from Melinda Brissett, and thank you for the contribution. Do a lot of audits at the moment not include testing controls in practice versus documented controls? What do you think about this?
Wow, do I ever agree? There's lots of times, especially as growing up in my past, I've done a lot of assessment work and being a PCI QSA specifically. Um, it's one thing for you to have documented controls. It's another thing for you to demonstrate evidence of those controls. It's entirely different for you to test and actually see if those controls are in place. And, part of a lot of the assessment work that I've done over, the last 10 years or so has really been focused on testing for evidence that the controls are doing actually what the controls are meant to do, right? Large organizations is hard to do because you have to sample and you can't test everything. But like I said earlier, when you have a policy, that policy directs a control objective. The control objective directs a control, and it's typically technically enforced. That technical control might be endpoint detection or endpoint protection, and it might be only deployed across 60% of your employees. Well, do you actually now meet the control, or do you partially meet the control? And if you test the 60% of employees for that endpoint protection, and you find that only 20% of it is actually enforcing the policy as it was written in the first place, is the endpoint control, is that control technically doing what the control is meant to do? So that's a great question, and I often find that there's distance between the policy and the actual control enforcement. And I find it the same way in secure software development. None of us are test-driven developers. None of us are security-driven development. It's hard to do. It adds time, and it adds quality. The reality is that threat modeling is difficult. It's very difficult because you need to think like an attacker. And most developers, most product managers, they don't think like attackers. And I've seen some some forward-looking organizations that embed security into their product teams so that they have these forward-thinking threat modelers that are saying, well, how can an unintended use of this product actually create a security exploit? And I don't mean cross-site scripting. What I mean is, if I can find a workaround so I can get my job done, an attacker can find a workaround so that they can actually use the system to attack us, right? So yeah, that was a great question.
So, next question coming from David Roach. What is your recommendation to implement a robust AI governance framework?
Wow, we need a whole separate webinar just for that. So I'm working
You're
with
always welcome, Patrick.
yes, yes. So I'm working with Cesar to actually publish some research
Mhm.
with the Good Governance Academy around implementing AI security controls. So I have actually written some research around AI as a threat vector and agentic AI and its use across the kill chain, the MITRE ATT&CK kill chain. I'm going to adapt that and publish that in the near future with the Good Governance Academy so that folks have a bit more of a roadmap. But essentially, in my 30-second guidance, assess where you're using AI today and understand how that models into your business. There are great chances that there's no governance around that. There's no policies around how you use AI. Tool adoption is happening fragmented in the business. There's no governance around the data that you use it with or that you share it with oftentimes. And then when you do, what is the governance model around the data for approved AI projects? And is architecture involved? Yes, those scary architects that always slow projects down, but they truly make them better. And yeah, I would start with mapping out where the organization is using AI to start, and hold your breath a little bit. The research will be coming out with the Good Governance Academy shortly.
Thank you. And Sharon Fikeli Mincy, could you kindly share the title of the book and where one can source it? Your
Oh,
valuable
sure.
work book.
Yeah, sure. It's Integrated Assurance, Unified Risk Strategy. It is available on Amazon, so you can look it up either by my name, Patrick Hayes, or by Integrated Assurance, Unified Risk Strategy. And it's also available through the CRC Press and Taylor Publishing. So, yeah, it actually is released on September 25th, although I think some folks have gotten some early editions by placing pre-orders.
And Walter is also asking, is your book available in South Africa other than purchasing through Amazon?
Yeah, so through the publisher's website, you should be able to buy anywhere across the world. And I'll share the publisher's website with Good Governance Academy so that everybody has that.
So thank you very much for all the questions and adding value to our webinar. And thank you so much, Patrick, for sharing your expertise and giving us such valuable insights today. Your perspective on integrated assurance and unifying cybersecurity with business performance, which is quite important topic, have given us a lot to think about as we look at the future of resilience and specifically the risk management in digital environment. And I'd also like to thank all of you for joining us, for your engagement throughout this session. And we hope today's discussions inspire you to take new ideas back to your organizations and your future careers and put them into practice. And you'd like to learn more about Patrick's work, I truly encourage you to check out this book, Integrated Assurance Unified Risk Strategy, and specifically defining the integrated assurance maturity model. And on behalf of Good Governance Academy, thank you again for being here, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar with new esteemed guest speakers like Patrick. Thank you very much for all of you, and greetings and best regards from Ankara, Turkey, and Patrick from Michigan, and many thanks for joining us.